Episode 26 of the World Builder's Anvil. Today's topic, racial makeup of your culture. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back. As always, I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram, and today's topic is racial makeup of your culture. This should once again be a relatively short episode. However, there are some certain very important things I think are worth pointing out when you talk about racial makeup of a culture. And once again, if you've not yet subscribed, rated, or reviewed our show on iTunes, please do. This will help other people find our show. And hopefully, the more people we can help, the longer I can do it for, and the more value you can get back from the show. So when I like to think about racial makeup of cultures, I usually start from the premise, right or wrong, and this is how it's worked out in my world, and it doesn't have to be the same for your world, is whenever cultures are created, it's of one race in a world. And this is very early on. They first gain sentient thought, and they start using that thought to describe things and create stories around things. It's usually one cultural group. And if you have sort of a symbiotic relationship between races, sort of like a pilot fish to a shark, and they're both sentient beings at this point, that could be an exception. So you don't always still start that way, but I think usually when a race first becomes sentient in a multi-race world, whether it's Token or any of the myriad other multi-race worlds, this is a huge, huge thing to think of because I don't think it's often thought about enough. So first, we're probably starting with one race in the culture. And the race is probably migrating. So it's probably hunter-gathering. It's trying to sustain itself. And in those gatherings, they're going to bump into other tribes. And those other tribes might have a completely different culture than them. They might have a similar culture, or they might really even be part of the same cultural group, where they have the same sort of language that they're developing. They have the same sorts of gods. Early beliefs are very similar. But over time, you have a vying for better hunting grounds, and cultural groups are going to slightly shift around, and you're going to start bumping into other cultures or other races. And once that starts happening, the dynamic of the culture is going to change from a one-race culture. And it might be for a very limited period of time, or it could be for a longer period of time. The longer you have the interaction with the multiple races, they're going to have different kinds of strengths, different kinds of weaknesses, and it's going to change the mix of things that become important to the culture. Even if the racial group is considered a second class or a worse level of citizen, just the fact you're dealing with this means your culture has to change. No one lives in a vacuum. And when a culture isn't affected like people are to new stimulus, it's not going to feel as natural. And maybe you don't want to deal with it in your world. Maybe people won't even notice it. I would like to think I would, but I might not be your perfect target audience there. So back to this idea of migration. You have a couple different possibilities of what's going to happen when you're migrating early on. And this is a sort of a pre-settled society phase. You're going to run into another cultural group. They're going to help answer some of the things that you're looking for answers for. So the two groups kind of merge into one slightly new group. And they're going to take certain beliefs and rituals from each of the cultures, and they're going to bring them together, and they're going to be sort of one new culture out of these two cultures that once existed. For that to happen, you'll probably need to have at least one of the cultural groups. Well, actually, both of the cultural groups will probably have to add value to each other. Because usually in this time frame, people are struggling to live. So for them to accept and grow and learn with you, there needs to have that level of interaction. You need to add value to each other so you both can survive in the world better. Later on, when cultures merge together, that becomes a little less. It's more about proximity. But early on, it's going to be a lot more about adding value to each other. And ultimately, no matter what you gain, let's say like an Italian-American cuisine in America, thank goodness, or Mexican-American cuisine, or Chinese cuisine, any of these wonderful things that have been added into American culture from other culture groups that have moved here. Whenever you have those things that change the culture, there is always some level of value being added to the culture from it. Usually you take the strengths and not the weaknesses of each other and come out a little bit better. And maybe you address your own current weakness by the strength of what you're taking from this other culture. If you're not merging, you might just have proximity. So the Roman religion, an alphabet, was derived from a different alphabet and a different religion. Not everyone starts with the names of their gods from scratch. Or some of the stories, there may be a derivative work, possibly plagiarized from a different culture. They won't look at it that way, probably. You're sort of taking on their culture, but you're adapting it to the needs of the area you live in. And that's a very common occurrence for cultures. Not everyone is going to have a unique alphabet. It just won't work out that way, because if you're next door and you have an alphabet and we can see the value of an alphabet, we're going to take the same alphabet you have and adapt it to our needs. And even if our sounds are slightly different, our letters will look the same. And maybe over time there'll be more and more deviation. But at that seminal moment where we take the alphabet, it will be strictly taken from you directly. And then if we have other sounds that aren't encapsulated in your alphabet, we'll come up with new letters or symbols to indicate that sound to fill out the needs of our culture. Sometimes a culture or race will actually take the other race's culture. Let's say, for instance, you have like this tribal horde of people and there's a huge drought that forces them to the shores. They're not strong enough to overthrow your culture. However, because of this multi-generational drought, they can't go back. So they're actually forced to adapt into your culture. Now, this is going to be one of those circumstances where you have a new race going into the mix of your culture. And so the culture will change and take some of the strengths, some of the traits from that culture into it, but not everything. And it will probably be one of those areas where they're second-class citizens, at least for a period of time. And hopefully for that race that is moving into the new culture, they will gain value over time. Whatever happens in the story is what happens. I mean, in real life, it's uncommon for that to happen. It probably happens more than either one of the cultures want to admit. Usually, if you're not French and you move to France, you're going to be treated like a non-French person, even if you live there. If you learn the language and the more things that you take in from that culture, the better you'll fit in. But especially as an American, you're always an American, unless you decide to opt out. Which, once you get into States, that's something else you're going to have to deal with when you get to that. So, once you have multiple races merging inside of a culture, you have to consider what is the status of the newer race. And it's probably going to just be a numbers game. If 95% of the culture is one race and 5% is the other race, the sad fact is that 5% race will probably be treated very poorly. Now, the exception to that rule would be if they're super powerful and it doesn't matter that you have 95% larger numbers, we would defeat you in battle. So, we are the de facto new nobility of your culture. And even though we're the minor culture, maybe we're forcing you into our cultural needs and you become the second-class citizens. However, you have to have a huge discrepancy in power. The closer the percentages of the races get together, the more, due to necessity, the culture is going to adapt to both of those races, or it's going to split apart. But you need to understand what the status is of the race. If you have two cultures kind of merging and they happen to be of different races, they'll probably be on more of an equal status. But if you have a scenario where one needs the other one more than the other one, the race with a greater need will probably, but not always, be considered second-class citizens, whether it's gypsies or whatever in the real world. And the need could be generated by the larger culture, don't get me wrong. It isn't necessarily weakness of the smaller culture. It's just a necessity of numbers. Now, the next thing you have to deal with, once you start having a multiple race culture, is what's going to happen when they have babies. And there could be a couple different scenarios. Like, they might not be able to have babies. This isn't like a black, white, Asian thing on Earth. The species might be radically different, and there might not be an ability to have babies. Whether it's symbiotic or for whatever reason is, then you don't have to worry about this. But if they can have babies, what happens? Are they half-breeds? Sort of like your classic half-orc from D&D, or half-elf from Token or D&D. You could deal with it like that. I actually, in my world, one of the human traits is genetic adaptability. And what will happen is the human genetics will, if you have a first-generation mating, it will be like half. However, those human traits are hard to get rid of. So if you have a half-elf breed with a full elf, you get a half-elf. It will never be, none of its descendants, no matter how long it breeds with another elf, will ever be a full elf again. Now, with some of the other species, there's this half species, and then it will start moving back towards whichever race has the majority of the parents, and to where you might have, for all extensive purposes, a full elf again. In my world, humans, through genetics, will breed out other races. Now, the rating for this episode. The rating for this episode is basic. Once again, a lot of people don't think about races and cultures being separate. You really should. Because the further you get away from day one of a culture forming, it's going to evolve, and it's more than likely going to start taking other culture groups and mixing in, other races mixing in. It's going to become part of a state, and maybe that state becomes multiple states. Who knows? It's a journey of the culture from the beginning. So it's probably not going to be one race. So you have to understand what the racial makeup is and what is the conclusion of that. If you have a scenario where you have two human and elf breeding and there's 50-50, maybe within, 3 generations, if genetically the likelihood is to be the same, if that happens and you start having this half-elf, maybe the whole race becomes half-elf. Maybe it becomes a new race. But how long does that happen? At the time of your story, maybe you're in the process of going from a half-elf, half-human to a mixture of both. You will probably have, especially early on, people who won't breed with the other race. But the likelihood is the culture becomes one, you'll see more and more of that happening. But you need to know what your racial makeup is. You need to know how you got to where you are. And you need to know where you're going, but not a lot, because once again, unless you're planning future stories in the world, it's not important. If you want to know how your world's going to grow and you want to say multiple stories from the same world, you need to know the conclusion of when you have racial collisions in cultures. And it might not always be, and I don't like to talk about this, but it might not always be voluntary. So let's say you have a human culture invading an area to raid. They might leave some babies behind that weren't asked for by the race that's there. And how do they get dealt with? So that won't necessarily affect, it will definitely affect the culture, but in a slightly different way than if you have two cultures intermingling voluntarily. The world building task for the day. List your main culture's racial makeup. Even if it's early, even if it's 100% human, know where it's at. If you reuse it later on and it's changed, you have to update it. The real world task for the day. Remember, it's not about you. Now, a lot of times you have interactions with people you love in your life, and you'll feel like that they're picking on you. They're making you feel bad. They're making you go over to your mother-in-law's house because they hate you. No, they're just doing it maybe because they want you there. Most of the time, when you interact with people you love and they're making you do something that's not pleasant, it's not because they're trying to make your life difficult. And just keep that in mind. And if you're truly in a case where they're trying to make it difficult, you have different problems. But in general, people aren't trying to make the lives difficult of the people they live with. Maybe I'm naive here, I don't know. But in my experience, most of the time, if you hear something that is offensive to you in that way, it's probably you're just upset and offended by nothing. Take time to at least think about it. Make sure it's what it is before you get into a fight over it. Luckily, I don't have this problem in my marriage. If you do, you really need to work on this. It'll make your life a lot easier if you can realize they're not making you do things that you don't like because they're just trying to be difficult. The tease is fantasy, cultural, arts, and architecture. This will be a slight deviation from dress. Dress is part of it, but I deal with arts and architecture separately. And it'll also kind of be a lead-in back towards countries again. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike, while the myth rolls high.